You have 30 minutes to clear your desk, Julian sneered, tossing my severance package on the glass table. Your methods are outdated. You belong in a museum, not in my company. What he didn't know was that I had just spent the last 3 months secretly buying up 51% of his father's legacy. 22 years ago, when the concept of integrated supply chain software was still in its infancy, I walked into a small, humid office space on the outskirts of Chicago. Nathaniel Vance, a sharp-eyed entrepreneur with more ambition than capital, had just founded Apex Logistics Solutions. He had the vision for a national freight brokerage, but he had absolutely no idea how to build the operational backbone to support it. That was where I came in. I was 30 years old at the time, armed with a background in systems architecture and a relentless drive to build something from the ground up. Nathaniel offered me a meager salary but promised me a slice of the pie if we ever made it big. I took the job as his chief operations officer. Over the next 2 decades, we transformed Apex Logistics Solutions from a struggling startup in a rented warehouse into a corporate titan valued at $120 million. We handled freight manifests, customs port clearances, and LTL carrier agreements for some of the largest retailers in North America. I built the entire operational framework. Every routing algorithm, every vendor compliance protocol, and every risk management system bore my signature. I knew the company's nervous system better than I knew my own heartbeat. Nathaniel and I were a perfect team. He was the charismatic frontman who shook hands and charmed investors, while I was the architect who ensured the engine never stalled. But as the years passed, the corporate landscape shifted. We brought in silent partners to fund our expansion, diluting our original equity. Nathaniel retained 30% of the voting shares, while I held 20%. The remaining 50% was scattered among various private equity firms and independent board members. It was a delicate balance of power, but it worked because Nathaniel and I always voted as a bloc. We were untouchable, until Nathaniel's health began to fail. At 65, Nathaniel suffered a severe stroke that left him largely incapacitated. The board of directors held an emergency session to determine the future of the company. It was a somber affair, filled with forced sympathies and aggressive posturing. I expected to be named interim CEO, given my 22 years of operational leadership and intimate knowledge of the company's inner workings. Instead, Nathaniel's son, Julian, stepped into the room. Julian was 32 years old, armed with an MBA from an elite university and a staggering sense of entitlement. He had never worked a day in the logistics industry. His entire professional experience consisted of a brief stint at a boutique consulting firm where he produced flashy PowerPoint presentations filled with empty buzzwords. But he had Nathaniel's power of attorney, and more importantly, he had inherited his father's 30% voting bloc. Julian convinced the private equity board members that the company needed fresh blood and a modernized vision. He spoke of leveraging blockchain technology and artificial intelligence in ways that made absolutely no operational sense for our specific market. But the board members, dazzled by his pedigree and eager for a quick exit strategy, voted him in as the new chief executive officer. I watched in silent disbelief as control of the company I had built with my bare hands was handed over to a man who didn't know the difference between a bill of lading and a customs declaration. From day one, Julian made it his mission to dismantle everything I had built. He despised me. He saw me as a relic of his father's era, a stubborn obstacle standing in the way of his grand, misguided vision. He wanted to pivot the company away from our core freight brokerage business and rebrand us as a tech-forward logistics disruptor. It was a suicide mission. Our clients didn't care about flashy tech. They cared about reliability, compliance, and cost efficiency. But Julian wouldn't listen. He surrounded himself with a cadre of frat bro executives, friends from his MBA program, who were equally clueless about the realities of supply chain management. They spent their days in endless strategy meetings, drawing up elaborate roadmaps while the actual operations of the company began to fray at the edges. I tried to guide him. I tried to explain the complexities of our LTL carrier agreements and the strict regulatory requirements of our hazardous materials manifests. I showed him the data, the profit margins, the delicate ecosystem of vendor relationships that kept the company afloat, but Julian dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. "You're thinking too small, Martin," he would say, leaning back in his leather chair with a condescending smirk. "We need to scale. We need to disrupt. You're too focused on the plumbing." The plumbing was what kept the $120 million house from collapsing. But I knew arguing with him was futile. Julian was determined to push me out. He began systematically stripping away my authority, reassigning my direct reports to his incompetent friends, and excluding me from critical executive meetings. He was laying the groundwork for my termination, building a narrative that I was insubordinate, resistant to change, and ultimately obsolete. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of corporate chess. He thought he was outmaneuvering the old man. But Julian fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power in a corporation. He believed power came from a job title, a corner office, and a loud voice in the boardroom. He didn't realize that true power lies in leverage, in equity, and in the quiet accumulation of voting rights. As I watched him systematically alienate our core clients and frustrate the independent board members with his erratic decisions, I saw an opportunity. The silent partners, the private equity guys who had backed him, were growing nervous. They were watching their investment hemorrhage value as Julian's disruptive strategies failed to materialize into actual revenue. They wanted out, but they were trapped in a sinking ship. That was when I made a phone call to Elias Thorne. Elias was a brilliant M&A attorney, a master of corporate restructuring and stealth acquisitions. We had crossed paths a decade earlier during a complex vendor buyout, and I knew he possessed the precise blend of legal acumen and tactical ruthlessness I needed. We met in a dimly lit steakhouse downtown, far away from the prying eyes of the Apex corporate office. Over a glass of scotch, I laid out my plan. It was audacious, legally complex, and required absolute secrecy. But if executed correctly, it would not only save the company I had spent half my life building, it would completely neutralize Julian Vance. Julian controls his father's 30%, I explained to Elias, sliding a detailed cap table across the table. I hold 20%. The remaining 50% is held by 3 distinct private equity groups and 2 independent board members. They're bleeding money, and they're terrified of Julian's leadership. If we can quietly buy out their shares through a blind trust or a proxy holding company, we can accumulate a controlling interest. We can hit 51%. Elias studied the documents, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the legal mechanics. It's a classic creeping takeover, he murmured. Under the Williams Act, specifically Section 13D, once a person or group acquires beneficial ownership of more than 5% of a voting class of a company's equity securities, they must file a Schedule 13D with the SEC within 10 days. But since Apex is still technically a private entity with a closely held board, we can maneuver through a series of private tender offers. We set up a limited liability company, completely insulated from your name, to act as the purchasing vehicle. We approach the minority shareholders individually, offering them a premium on their current valuation to exit quietly. Exactly, I said, a cold resolve settling in my chest. They get their liquidity event, and I get the votes. For the next 3 months, while Julian was busy hosting lavish corporate retreats and redesigning the company logo, I was busy executing a phantom buyout. Elias set up Vanguard Holdings LLC, a corporate entity registered in Delaware with layers of anonymity protecting its true beneficiary. Through Vanguard, we systematically approached the frustrated private equity partners. We leveraged their growing panic over Julian's mismanagement, offering them a clean exit at a slight premium based on a $120 million valuation. It was a massive financial undertaking. I leveraged my personal assets, liquidated my retirement accounts, and secured a substantial line of credit based on the 20% equity I already owned. It was the ultimate gamble. I was risking everything I had ever earned on a single strategic strike. One by one, the silent partners folded. They signed the transfer agreements, quietly selling their voting shares to Vanguard Holdings. 10% here, 15% there. By the end of the second month, Vanguard held 28% of the company. Combined with my personal 20%, I controlled 48% of the voting power. I was agonizingly close to the threshold. I just needed one more board member to flip. The final target was Victor Wallace, an independent board member who held a crucial 3% stake. Victor was a seasoned logistics veteran, one of the few people on the board who actually understood the industry. He had been a vocal critic of Julian's policies, but he was also deeply loyal to Nathaniel's legacy. Elias and I met with Victor in a private suite at a downtown hotel. I laid everything on the table. I showed him the disastrous financial projections resulting from Julian's strategies, the alienated clients, the crumbling operational infrastructure. And then I revealed my hand. I told him about Vanguard Holdings. I told him that I was inches away from seizing control and stabilizing the company. Julian is destroying his father's company, I told Victor, looking him dead in the eye. If he stays in power, Apex will be bankrupt within 18 months. You know it, and I know it. Sell your 3% to Vanguard. Give me the 51% majority. Let me save the ship before it sinks. Victor stared at the transfer documents for a long time. He knew the gravity of what I was asking. He was signing away the final piece of the puzzle that would trigger a hostile takeover against the founder's son, but he also knew I was right. With a heavy sigh, Victor picked up his pen and signed his name. The mechanism was set. The trap was armed. I was now the beneficial owner of 51% of Apex Logistics Solutions. I was the majority shareholder. I was the boss. But Julian had no idea. He still thought he was the undisputed king of the castle, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath his feet had completely given way. The stage was perfectly set for our final confrontation. And Julian, in his infinite arrogance, walked right into it. It was a Tuesday morning when the final blow was struck. I arrived at the Apex Logistics Solutions headquarters at 6 in the morning, a routine I had maintained for the better part of 2 decades. The building was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead as I walked past the rows of empty cubicles. I liked the early hours. It was the only time I could review the overnight freight manifests and port clearance reports without interruption. But on this particular Tuesday, my routine was abruptly shattered. When I reached my office, a corner suite I had occupied for 15 years, I found my keycard deactivated. The small red light on the electronic reader blinked defiantly at me. I tried swiping it again, but the result was the same. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew immediately what was happening. This wasn't a glitch in the security system. This was a deliberate lockout. I took a deep breath, smoothing my tie, and walked down the hallway to the executive boardroom. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Julian Vance was leaning against the mahogany table, sipping a macchiato from an artisanal coffee shop down the street. He was flanked by two of his MBA cronies, Trent, the newly appointed Chief Visionary Officer, and Bryce, a guy whose only apparent qualification for the VP of Strategy role was his impeccable golf handicap. They were laughing about something, their voices echoing in the large, empty room. When I pushed the door open, the laughter stopped abruptly. Julian looked up, a predatory smirk spreading across his face. "Ah, Martin," Julian said, setting his coffee down. "You're early as always." "We were just discussing the new Q3 rollout." "My keycard has been deactivated, Julian," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the anger boiling beneath the surface. "Care to explain?" Julian let out a theatrical sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He walked over to a stack of folders on the table and picked up a thick manila envelope. "Look, Martin, we need to have a serious conversation about the direction of this company. My father built a great foundation, sure, and you were a part of that, but the industry is changing. Logistics isn't just about moving boxes on trucks anymore. It's about data analytics. It's about AI-driven supply chain optimization. It's about creating a frictionless, tech-forward ecosystem." He was reciting buzzwords from a slide deck, completely disconnected from the brutal, physical reality of our business. "Our clients don't care about a frictionless ecosystem, Julian," I replied, keeping my tone measured. "They care that their hazmat shipments cross the border before the customs port closes at 5. They care that our LTL carriers meet their delivery windows so their retail shelves aren't empty. We run a freight brokerage, not a Silicon Valley startup." Trent scoffed loudly from the corner. "That's exactly the kind of legacy thinking that's holding us back, Martin." Julian nodded in agreement. "Exactly. You're stuck in the past, Martin. You're micromanaging routing algorithms when you should be thinking about our global digital footprint." The board and I had a long discussion yesterday evening. We need leadership that understands the new paradigm. Leadership that isn't afraid to disrupt the status quo. "By board, you mean your private equity friends who haven't seen a positive ROI since you took over?" I countered, unable to resist the jab. Julian's smirk vanished, his jaw tightening. He didn't like being challenged, especially in front of his sycophants. He threw the manila envelope across the glass table. It slid to a stop right in front of me. "You have 30 minutes to clear your desk," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Your methods are outdated. You belong in a museum, not in my company. We're restructuring the executive team and your position is being eliminated." I looked down at the envelope. It was the severance package. 22 years of building this empire, reduced to a stack of legal documents and a 30-minute eviction notice. According to my employment contract, a termination without cause entitled me to 12 months of my base salary, which amounted to $300,000, plus the immediate vesting of any outstanding stock options. But I already owned 20% of the company directly, and another 31% through Vanguard Holdings. Julian thought he was tossing me a bone. He had no idea he was handing a severance package to the majority shareholder. I said simply. I didn't yell, I didn't throw a tantrum. I didn't threaten him with lawsuits or remind him of everything I had done for his father. I remained perfectly calm, calculating the exact trajectory of the explosive charge he had just detonated under his own chair. Julian seemed disappointed by my lack of reaction. He wanted a fight. He wanted to assert his dominance, to humiliate the old guard and prove to his friends that he was the undisputed alpha in the room. "The severance package is generous," he continued, leaning forward aggressively. 12 months' pay, standard non-compete clauses. Sign it by 5 o'clock today, or our legal team will make this very difficult for you. We'll find cause if we have to. We'll audit your division and pin every operational failure of the last 6 months on your gross negligence." It was a hollow threat, but it demonstrated the sheer depth of his arrogance. He believed he was invincible. He believed his inherited 30% voting bloc gave him absolute authority to rewrite history and discard anyone who didn't fit his narrative. "I will review the documents," I said. picking up the envelope. But before I go, Julian, I feel obligated to warn you about the upcoming carrier renegotiations. The contracts with our top 3 LTL providers expire at the end of the month. If those aren't handled with extreme care, we'll lose 30% of our regional capacity overnight. Julian rolled his eyes. Don't worry about the carriers, Martin. Bryce here has already drafted a new vendor integration protocol. We're going to automate the bidding process. The algorithm will handle the negotiations. Bryce puffed out his chest, looking entirely too proud of a concept he clearly didn't understand. Automating LTL contract negotiations was corporate suicide. These were complex agreements involving fuel surcharges, liability limits, and unionized labor restrictions. An algorithm couldn't negotiate a hazmat liability waiver with a grizzled trucking dispatcher in Ohio, but I wasn't going to stop them. They were digging their own graves, and I was perfectly content to hand them the shovels. Understood, I replied quietly. I'll pack my things. Security will escort you out, Julian added, a cruel smile returning to his face. Just standard protocol, nothing personal. It was entirely personal, of course. It was about ego. It was about a son trying to erase his father's shadow by destroying the man who helped build it. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, the severance envelope tucked under my arm. 2 burly security guards were already waiting in the hallway. They looked uncomfortable, having known me for years. I gave them a reassuring nod, signaling that there would be no trouble. As I packed up my office, placing 22 years of memories into a single cardboard box, my mind was already shifting into a higher gear. I didn't feel defeated. I felt a cold, sharp sense of anticipation. Julian thought he had just eliminated his biggest obstacle. He thought he had cleared the path for his grand vision. He had no idea that by firing me, he had just removed the only firewall standing between his incompetence and total operational collapse. More importantly, he didn't realize the legal implications of what he had just done. By terminating my employment, he had triggered a specific clause in the corporate bylaws regarding the composition of the executive board. A clause that required an emergency shareholder vote to approve any major restructuring. And as of yesterday evening, when Victor Wallace signed the final transfer documents, I possessed the 51% majority required to call that vote, dictate its outcome, and completely restructure the company on my own terms. I carried my box past the reception desk, the security guards trailing awkwardly behind me. I stepped out into the crisp morning air, the sun just beginning to rise over the city skyline. I pulled out my phone and dialed Elias Thorne's number. He answered on the second ring. It's done, I said, staring up at the Apex Logistics Solutions logo on the side of the building. He fired me. Excellent, Elias replied, his voice crackling with professional excitement. Do you have the severance documents? In my hand. Don't sign anything. I'm filing the Schedule 13D with the SEC right now. Vanguard Holdings will be officially on the books as the majority shareholder by noon. We'll serve the formal notice of the hostile takeover to their legal department immediately after. And the emergency board meeting? I asked, drafting the mandate as we speak. Under Section 4 of the corporate bylaws, a majority shareholder can compel an emergency session within 24 hours. We're scheduling it for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I smiled, a genuine expression of satisfaction. Julian Vance had given me exactly 30 minutes to clear my desk. I was going to give him exactly 24 hours to clear his. The game of corporate chess was over, and he didn't even know he had been checkmated. The hours following my departure from the Apex headquarters were a masterclass in orchestrated corporate warfare. While Julian and his frat bro executives were likely popping champagne and celebrating their supposed victory over the old guard, Elias Thorne and I were situated in a war room at his law firm, finalizing the kill switch. The legal mechanism we were deploying was brutally efficient. It relied on a combination of the Williams Act disclosures and a specific poison pill bypass I had woven into the corporate bylaws over a decade ago, back when Nathaniel and I were trying to protect the company from outside raiders. Ironically, the very defensive measures I had designed to protect the founder's legacy were now being weaponized against his arrogant son. At exactly 12 p.m. East, Elias hit send on the electronic filing system. The Schedule 13D was officially lodged with the Securities and Exchange Commission. It publicly declared that Vanguard Holdings LLC had acquired beneficial ownership of 51% of the voting shares in Apex Logistics Solutions. The filing detailed the series of private tender offers and explicitly named me, Martin Gallagher, as the sole managing member of Vanguard Holdings. The phantom was no longer a phantom. The ghost had just walked into the room and locked the door from the inside. 10 minutes later, Elias drafted the formal hostile takeover notification. It wasn't a request for negotiation. It was a legal mandate. It was addressed directly to Julian Vance and the remaining board members, delivered via certified digital courier to their legal department, and carbon-copied to Julian's personal email. The document was an absolute masterpiece of legal aggression. It outlined the 51% majority, cited Section 4 of the corporate bylaws, and unilaterally called for an emergency board meeting at 9 a.m. the following morning. The agenda for that meeting contained only two items: the immediate termination of Julian Vance as Chief Executive Officer, and the appointment of Martin Gallagher as the new CEO and Chairman of the Board. We sat back and watched the clock. In a corporate takeover of this magnitude, the silence before the storm is always the most intense part. You wait for the exact moment the realization hits the target. For Julian, that moment arrived at 1:47 p.m. My personal cell phone resting on the conference table suddenly vibrated, the screen lighting up with Julian's name. Elias and I exchanged a look. I let it ring. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again. This time it was the Apex General Counsel, a harried corporate lawyer named Sarah, who had always been out of her depth. I let her go to voicemail as well. I wasn't going to negotiate over the phone. The trap was sprung, and there was no way out. While the legal panic was unfolding on Julian's end, the operational reality of my absence was already beginning to trigger massive shockwaves across the Apex infrastructure. For 22 years, I hadn't just managed the company. I was the primary license holder for our specialized freight operations. When we expanded into hazardous materials transport a decade ago, the Department of Transportation required a designated responsible party to hold the primary hazmat safety permit. Because Nathaniel hated dealing with federal bureaucrats, I had registered the permit under my own name and credentials, leasing the operational rights back to Apex on a rolling annual contract. It was a brilliant, highly specialized fail-safe. If Apex ever tried to operate without me, the lease agreement would instantly void, effectively revoking their legal authority to transport hazardous materials. Julian, in his haste to fire me and implement his frictionless ecosystem, hadn't bothered to read the fine print of our regulatory compliance framework. He didn't know that my termination constituted a material breach of the lease agreement. At 2:30 p.m., I logged into my personal DOT portal and officially withdrew my authorization, citing my involuntary separation from the company. The revocation was instantaneous. Automated alerts were blasted out to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration database. Every single Apex freight truck currently hauling chemicals, industrial solvents, or flammable liquids immediately lost its legal clearance to move. The ensuing chaos was catastrophic. By 3:15 p.m., my phone was blowing up with frantic text messages from regional dispatchers who were still loyal to me. They were painting a picture of total systemic collapse. Dozens of 18-wheelers were being stopped at state way stations and border crossings. State troopers and DOT inspectors were pulling our drivers over, scanning their digital manifests, and realizing the company's hazmat permit was flagged as in-NEF. Trucks were being impounded. Fines were racking up by the thousands every hour. The supply chain for 3 of our largest industrial clients ground to a screeching, violent halt. And Julian's brilliant automated AI negotiation algorithm, it was actively making things worse. Bryce had apparently launched the new software immediately after I was escorted out, eager to prove his worth. The algorithm, completely lacking context for the complex human negotiations required in LTL freight, began sending aggressive, low-ball automated bids to our core carrier network. The carriers, many of whom I had spent a decade building personal relationships with, were insulted. They saw the automated emails, saw the absurdly low rates, and immediately rejected the bids. Within 3 hours, Apex lost access to 40% of its regional trucking capacity. The tech-forward disruptor was effectively paralyzing its own business model. At 4 p.m., the dam broke. Julian realized the magnitude of the disaster. He couldn't reach me, so he sent his general counsel, Sarah, to Elias Thorne's office in person. She arrived looking like she hadn't slept in a week, clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a life preserver. We ushered her into the war room. "Mr. Gallagher, Elias," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "There has been a massive misunderstanding. The termination this morning, it was premature." Julian acted emotionally. "We need to rescind the severance offer and reinstate you immediately. The DOT just flagged our entire hazmat fleet, and the carriers are threatening to terminate their master service agreements." "There was no misunderstanding, Sarah," I replied calmly, pouring myself a glass of water. Julian made his intentions perfectly clear. He told me I was obsolete. He gave me 30 minutes to pack my things. "The termination is binding, but the hostile takeover notice," Sarah pleaded, looking at the documents spread across the table. "Julian controls 30%. He has the backing of the founder's estate. You can't just seize control of a $120 million company in an afternoon." Elias stepped in, his tone razor sharp. "Actually, Sarah, we can. And we did. Under Section 13 of the Williams Act, Vanguard Holdings has established a clear, legally sound 51% majority. We acquired the shares legally from the private equity partners and Victor Wallace. Julian's 30% is now a minority stake. He has no authority to block the emergency board meeting tomorrow, and he has no authority to stop his own termination. Sarah looked physically ill. She knew Elias was right. She had read the bylaws. She knew the trap was airtight. Julian wants to buy you out, she said desperately, pulling a document from her briefcase. He's authorized me to offer you a $40 million buyout for your Vanguard shares, plus a $10 million consulting fee to reinstate the hazmat permits and fix the carrier network. $50 million, Martin. You can walk away incredibly wealthy. It was a staggering amount of money. For a split second, the sheer magnitude of the offer hung in the air. But this was never about the money. It was about respect. It was about protecting 22 years of my life's work from a spoiled, arrogant child who wanted to tear it down for a vanity project. Julian thought he could throw his father's money at the problem to make it go away. He thought everyone had a price. Tell Julian, I said. Leaning forward, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, that Vanguard Holdings is not for sale. Not for 50 million. Not for 100 million. Tell him that tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock he is going to stand in front of the board, and he is going to hand me the keys to my company. If he refuses, I will let the hazmat fleet sit impounded at the way stations until Apex is bankrupt. Sarah stared at me, realizing the absolute finality of my words. There was no negotiation, there was no compromise. She slowly packed her briefcase, her hands shaking, and left the room without another word. The kill switch had been fully activated. The systems were collapsing, the legal walls were closing in, and Julian Vance was trapped in a burning building with no exits. All that was left was to watch the ashes fall in the morning. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the Apex Logistics Solutions headquarters was thick with panic. The corporate arrogance that had permeated the building just 24 hours earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by the frantic energy of a sinking ship. When Elias and I walked through the glass double doors at exactly 8:45 a.m., the reception area was in chaos. Phones were ringing off the hook, dispatchers were shouting across cubicles, and the digital tracking boards on the wall flashed angry red warnings indicating halted freight and missed delivery windows. The tech-forward disruptor was experiencing a very analog meltdown. We bypassed the frantic employees and headed straight for the executive boardroom. The two security guards who had awkwardly escorted me out the day before were standing by the door. They looked at me, then at Elias, and quickly stepped aside, opening the heavy mahogany doors for us. Inside, the scene was a stark contrast to the smug gathering of the previous morning. Julian Vance sat at the head of the long glass table, looking as though he had aged a decade overnight. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his designer tie was loosened, and his eyes were bloodshot from a lack of sleep. His MBA cronies, Trent and Bryce, were nowhere to be seen. In a crisis, sycophants are always the first to abandon ship. Only Sarah, the general counsel, sat next to Julian, vigorously rubbing her temples. Opposite them sat Victor Wallace, looking grim but resolute. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked to the opposite end of the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Elias stood behind me, opening his briefcase and arranging the Vanguard Holdings Incorporation documents and the SEC Schedule 13D filings on the glass surface. "Good morning, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence. "I trust you had time to review the $50 million rejection?" Julian glared at me, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. "This is illegal, Martin. What you're doing is extortion. You've hijacked the company's hazmat permits and sabotaged the carrier network. Your father built a great company," I interrupted sharply. "And then he got sick and you decided to tear it down to inflate your own ego. Don't talk to me about legality, Julian. Everything Vanguard Holdings did was executed perfectly within the boundaries of the Williams Act and the corporate bylaws. You fired me. You triggered the lease revocation. This catastrophic operational failure is entirely your own doing. I simply removed the safety net. You orchestrated a shadow buyout behind my back," Julian yelled, his composure finally shattering. He stood up, slamming his hands on the table. "You manipulated the private equity partners. You stole my company." "I bought your company, Julian," I corrected him calmly. "There's a significant difference. I bought it because you were driving it into the ground. At a $120 million valuation, your 30% stake is worth roughly $36 million. If I let this company hemorrhage clients and incur DOT fines for another month, that valuation will drop to $40 million and your stake will be worth $12. I'm actually protecting your inheritance. You should be thanking me." Victor Wallace cleared his throat. "Martin is right, Julian. The private equity groups wanted out. They saw the writing on the wall. Your strategies were alienating our core client base. Vanguard Holdings offered a clean exit. As a board member, my fiduciary duty is to the financial stability of this company. Vanguard represents stability. You represent liability." Julian looked at Victor, a sense of betrayal flashing across his face. He finally realized how utterly isolated he was. The frat bros were gone. The board had turned on him. The legal trap was flawless. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with crushing weight. He sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. "What do you want, Martin?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You have the majority. You have the permits. You've won. What do you want?" The agenda for this emergency session was clearly outlined in the hostile takeover mandate, Elias stated, stepping forward. Item 1. A vote to immediately terminate Julian Vance as Chief Executive Officer for cause, citing gross negligence and operational mismanagement. For cause? Sarah, the general counsel, interjected nervously. If you terminate him for cause, you void his severance package. He walks away with nothing but his equity. That's exactly the point, I said, leaning forward and locking eyes with Julian. Yesterday morning, you tried to fire me without cause. You tried to buy me off with a 12-month severance while you destroyed 22 years of my work. Now the board is going to fire you for cause because you deployed an automated algorithm that crippled our carrier network, because you failed to audit the regulatory compliance framework before terminating the primary permit holder, because you are fundamentally incompetent. Julian swallowed hard. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, palpable fear. If you fire me for cause, my father's estate, the tax implications, it'll ruin me. I let him sit with that terror for a long moment. I let him feel the exact same helplessness he had tried to inflict on me. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, save for the distant, muffled shouting from the dispatch floor outside. However, I finally said, leaning back in my chair, I am a pragmatist. I don't want a protracted legal battle over the definition of cause, and I don't want the Vance name dragged through the mud for the sake of your father's legacy. So I will offer you a single, non-negotiable alternative. I motioned to Elias. He slid a crisp, newly printed document across the long glass table toward Julian. It wasn't a termination notice. It was a voluntary resignation letter, coupled with an irrevocable stock purchase agreement. Item 2 on the agenda, I continued. You will sign that resignation letter, effective immediately. You will publicly state that you are stepping down to pursue other entrepreneurial interests. In exchange, the board will not terminate you for cause. Furthermore, Vanguard Holdings will purchase your remaining 30% equity stake at a discounted valuation of $80 million. That's $24 million cash, Julian. It's a massive haircut from the $120 million valuation, but it's $24 million more than you'll get if I let the DOT shut us down permanently. Julian stared at the document. It was a brutal ultimatum. I was forcing him to surrender his title, his pride, and a significant portion of his wealth. I was buying his birthright at a steep discount, using the very crisis he had created as leverage. You're robbing me, Julian whispered, his hand shaking as he picked up the paper. I'm giving you a golden parachute, I corrected him coldly. A smaller one than you feel you deserve, perhaps, but a parachute nonetheless. The alternative is you hit the ground at terminal velocity. You have exactly 2 minutes to decide. If you don't sign it, Elias will call the vote, Victor and I will approve your termination for cause, and I will personally ensure this company bleeds out until your equity is worthless. Sarah leaned in, whispering frantically in Julian's ear. She was outlining the legal reality. She was telling him he had no leverage, no defense, and no way out. The SEC filings were airtight. The hazmat leverage was absolute. Vanguard Holdings held all the cards. Julian looked around the room one last time, searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. He looked at the empty chairs where his friends used to sit. He looked at Victor, who stared back with hardened resolve. And finally, he looked at me, the man he had dismissed as a relic, the man he had given 30 minutes to pack a box. With a trembling hand, Julian Vance picked up his pen. He didn't say a word as he signed the resignation letter. He didn't look up as he signed away his 30% equity to Vanguard Holdings. He simply executed the documents, slid them back across the table, and stood up. He looked completely defeated, a hollow shell of the arrogant heir who had strutted into the room the day before. He turned and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. Just as he reached for the handle, I spoke one last time. "Oh, Julian," I called out. He stopped but didn't turn around. "You have 30 minutes to clear your desk. Security will escort you out. Just standard protocol." He pushed through the doors and disappeared down the hallway. The boardroom was quiet again. I looked at Elias, who was already countersigning the documents, and then at Victor, who let out a long, exhausted breath. "Well," Victor said, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "That was certainly a more productive meeting than yesterday's." "Indeed," I replied, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "Now, if you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I have a company to run and a fleet of hazmat trucks to get moving." The immediate aftermath of Julian's resignation was a masterclass in crisis management and operational triage. I didn't waste a single second celebrating. As soon as the mahogany doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind him, I was on my phone, dialing the direct line to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Within 15 minutes, using my secure credentials and a pre-drafted reinstatement addendum Elias had prepared, I successfully reactivated the primary hazmat safety permit. The digital flag on our fleet was lifted almost instantaneously. I then walked straight out of the executive suite and onto the dispatch floor. The room was a cacophony of ringing phones and stressed voices. I stood at the center podium, picked up the PA microphone, and tapped it twice. The sharp sound cut through the noise, and within seconds, 70 dispatchers and logistics coordinators turned to look at me. The silence was absolute. "Julian Vance has resigned, effective immediately," I announced. My voice steady and amplified across the sprawling room. A collective audible gasp rippled through the floor, followed quickly by a wave of frantic whispering. "I have assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer, and Vanguard Holdings has acquired full controlling interest of Apex Logistics Solutions. The hazmat permits are active. The DOT flags are cleared. Get those trucks moving. Prioritize the industrial chemical accounts on the East Coast. Tell the way stations to refresh their databases." The floor erupted. It wasn't a cheer of celebration. It was the ferocious, focused energy of a highly trained team suddenly unleashed from the constraints of incompetence. Phones were snatched up, keyboards clattered relentlessly, and the angry red warnings on the digital tracking boards slowly began to turn a reassuring operational green. My next task was repairing the catastrophic damage Bryce's automated AI algorithm had inflicted on our LTL carrier network. I bypassed the shiny new software interface entirely and went straight to my analog Rolodex. I spent the next 6 hours locked in my new office, Julian's old office, making personal phone calls to the owners and head dispatchers of our top 30 carrier partners. I didn't use corporate speak. I didn't offer them a frictionless ecosystem. I offered them sincere apologies, a rollback to our previous negotiated rate structures, and a personal guarantee that the automated bidding system was permanently decommissioned. "It was a glitch in the new management software, Frank," I told a particularly irate fleet owner in Ohio who had rejected a hazmat load earlier that morning. "The kid who designed it is already cleaning out his desk. You'll have the revised master service agreement, with the standard fuel surcharges reinstated, in your inbox in 5 minutes. By the end of the day, 80% of our carrier capacity was restored. The bleeding had stopped. The company was stabilized. It had been the most chaotic, high-stakes 24 hours of my professional career, but as I sat back in the leather chair overlooking the city skyline, a profound sense of satisfaction washed over me. I had built this engine. I knew how to break it, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to put it back together. The financial mechanics of the takeover settled over the following weeks. Vanguard Holdings, now fully consolidated under my ownership, finalized the purchase of Julian's 30% stake for the agreed-upon $24 million. It was a massive capital outlay, heavily leveraged against the company's future revenues, but the math was solid. By eliminating the erratic decision-making and restoring our core client confidence, I projected a return to the $120 million valuation within 18 months. Julian, true to form, didn't handle his defeat with grace. He took his $24 million and immediately attempted to launch a boutique venture capital firm, branding himself as a logistics visionary who had successfully cashed out of a legacy company. He spent millions on PR campaigns and lavish launch parties, trying to rewrite the narrative of his exit. But the logistics industry is remarkably small, and corporate gossip travels faster than a priority freight manifest. Everyone who mattered knew the truth. They knew he hadn't cashed out. They knew he had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and forcefully ejected from his own father's company by the COO he had tried to discard. His venture firm struggled to attract serious founders. His frat bro executives scattered to the winds, and within a year his entrepreneurial interests quietly folded into a series of obscure, unprofitable tech investments. Nathaniel Vance, unfortunately, passed away 6 months after the takeover. It was a somber moment. Despite the viciousness of the corporate war with his son, I still harbored a deep respect for the man who had hired me 22 years ago. I attended the private memorial service, standing near the back, paying my respects to a complex legacy. Julian was there, of course, looking older and notably humbled. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The battlefield had been cleared and the spoils had been divided. Elias Thorne, the legal architect of the Phantom Buyout, billed me a staggering 7-figure sum for his services. I signed the wire transfer without a moment's hesitation. He had orchestrated a flawless creeping takeover under the Williams Act, shielding my identity through Vanguard Holdings just long enough to execute the fatal strike. It was the best money I had ever spent. We celebrated the final closing documents over a glass of scotch at the same dimly lit steakhouse where the plan had been hatched. "You know, Martin," Elias said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "I've handled dozens of hostile takeovers in my career. Poison pills, golden parachutes, proxy fights, but I've never seen someone leverage a Department of Transportation hazmat permit as a corporate kill switch. Power isn't always in the boardroom, Elias, I replied, a small smile playing on my lips. Sometimes power is knowing exactly which wire to cut to shut down the engine. Over the next 3 years, Apex Logistics Solutions didn't just recover, it thrived. Without the burden of Julian's vanity projects and misguided tech pivots, we refocused entirely on our core competencies. We expanded our hazmat operations, secured long-term contracts with major chemical manufacturers, and optimized our LTL carrier network using practical, data-driven analytics rather than flashy buzzwords. The company's valuation climbed steadily, surpassing the original $120 million and pushing toward the $150 million mark. I was no longer the chief operations officer working in the shadows. I was the chairman and CEO, the undisputed majority owner of an empire I had spent half my life building. I had walked into that boardroom on a Tuesday morning facing a humiliating termination and a 30-minute eviction notice. I walked out 24 hours later holding the keys to the kingdom. Whenever I walked past the executive boardroom, I would occasionally glance at the long mahogany table. I would remember the smug look on Julian's face when he tossed that severance package across the glass. He had thought he was a chess master, moving pieces on a board he barely understood. He didn't realize that while he was busy planning his next move, I had already bought the board, the pieces, and the table they were sitting on. It was a harsh lesson in corporate reality. You don't fire the architect when you're still standing inside the building, especially not when the architect holds the deed.